actually we could start.
Yes, we're live on Facebook. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Maria. So my name is Hanna Hopko. I'm the chairwoman of Democracy in Action International Conference and also head of ANTS initiative. From 2014 to 2019, I used to serve as the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Ukrainian Parliament. So it's my honor today to moderate, I think, very interesting discussion, the Gamble of Appeasement. Can Russia's imperial ambitions be stopped? So, and I'm also, it's my privilege also to introduce to you my today's speakers. It's Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, former Deputy Secretary General of Nato. I would like to say a friend of Ukraine and democracy. And also let me introduce Pavlo Grot, or Paul Grot, President of the Ukrainian World Congress. Pavlo, we are very thankful that today we will have, I think, very honest discussion and you will share your thoughts. So sitting in Kiev and expecting Christmas and New Year, of course, all Ukrainians, they would like to see some guarantees that all this information about new Putin's attack or invasion will never happen. But why I'm telling this? Because it's not a secret that approximately 100,000 Russian troops remain near Ukraine border with information that 10,000 may soon arrive. And within this 8 years of Russian military aggression against Ukraine, of course, we managed to build our army from scratch. And of course, we say that Ukrainians will resist. And also it's important to mention that over the past 8 years, the Kremlin leadership has taken considerable visible and covert measures to convince the world of Putin's real intentions to revive the Soviet evil empire. This policy is being implemented on the territory of Russia itself against the civil and human rights of indigenous peoples, as well as against other sovereign states and international organizations. Ukrainians feel the consequences of this Putin's criminal activity. By criminal activities, I mean also the poisoning of political opponents, targeted assassinations, artificial migrant crisis or war. And of course, these criminal activities, we feel the consequences in our daily lives. Russian ongoing armed aggression against Ukraine has forced millions of people to flee their homes. Every day, fighting inflicts injuries and deaths. The regime of occupation systematically violates the rights of local population, and more hostages are taken prisoners. And of course, it's really important to mention what the collective West could do and what is the strategy towards Russian hybrid warfare. And because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about also Western civilization. And before this important event, I went to my archive and I found two important letters, which I'm planning to start to show you these letters. This is the letters written and signed by Joe Biden. And the date of this letter is August 7, 2015. And the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, wrote me a letter as a member of the Parliament at that time. And let me quote one sentence from the letter from Joe Biden as a Vice President. If Russia fails to implement its obligations under these agreements or launches new military offenses across the line of contact, the United States will increase the cost to Russia for its aggression against Ukraine. Our sanctions on Russia for its action in Crimea will stay in place until Russia ends its occupations of Ukraine's sovereign territory. So this is the letter from 2015. When at that time Vice President Biden wrote that if Russia launches new military offensives across. So recently, during the phone call, Biden and Putin, there was information that if Putin dares to attack or to invade Ukraine again, I will try to be correct, because he invaded Ukraine in 2014 already. So actually, the US will impose measures which were not implemented in 2014. So let me start asking Ambassador Alexander Veshbov. And actually, of course, it would be important for you, Ambassador, to deliver a brief analysis of the West's current vision and understanding of developments in and around Ukraine. And what is the current discussion in Washington, D.C. regarding Ukraine? Because, of course, for us, it's within 8 years of Russian military aggression, we would like to see Putin implementing his obligations. But unfortunately, there is no ceasefire, there is no withdrawal of heavy artillery, there is no allowance of OSCE special monitoring mission to work at the occupied, temporary occupied territories. So in this situation, instead of seeing how collective West is reaching some progress by Putin to leave out Ukraine, we are seeing new blackmail, new threat of new escalation or new attack or new invasion. Why it happened like within 8 years, and now President Biden is also promising us a new and tougher sanctions. So what is your vision, and actually what is the West vision of the future relations with Ukraine, and actually what could be done more effectively to push Putin to leave Ukraine and not to escalate the situation?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Hannah. And let me try to address many of the different questions that you have raised. But first of all, let me thank you. Let me thank the Ukrainian World Congress for the opportunity to speak at today's event. We clearly have a very momentous subject to tackle today. Russia is threatening to unleash what could be the biggest crisis in European and transatlantic security since World War II. And today I hope we can shed some light on whether and how the West can prevent that. The situation on the ground remains very precarious. Russia continues to mass well over 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders. Unlike the buildup in the spring, Russia has now put in place much of the logistical tail and the supporting capabilities necessary to launch a large-scale invasion and occupation of Ukraine, which could be as early as mid to late January if Putin makes the decision to do so. Along with the troop buildup, Russia's information warfare is in full swing, making the case for why military action is justified in Moscow's opinion, while implausibly denying any intention to invade. The Kremlin propaganda is blaming both Ukrainian leaders and Nato for the crisis, portraying Russia as the aggrieved party rather than the aggressor. Now, I think that reading between the lines of all this propaganda, it's clear that Putin is exasperated by his failure to bring Ukraine to heel since 2014. He seems to fear that Ukraine will be lost to the West forever if he doesn't act now. Underlying Putin's frustration is his awareness that if Ukraine succeeds in becoming a stable, prosperous European state, the power of its example will pose an existential threat to the Putin regime. So I think that's how Putin sees the stakes, and that's why we must take the threat of military action very seriously. Now, while Putin is truly obsessed with Ukraine, you just have to read his pseudo-history to get that message loud and clear. It isn't clear what he actually wants to end the current crisis. He's put forward extravagant public demands that he knows are non-starters, that NATO abandon further enlargement, renounce its 2008 pledge that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. He's insisting that NATO put these in the form of legally binding security guarantees for Russia, implying that he will use force if NATO doesn't comply with this ultimatum. And of course, NATO doesn't like ultimatums. Meanwhile, Russia continues to accuse Ukraine of preparing new aggression in Donbass and is demanding that Kiev implement the political aspects of the Minsk agreements as Moscow interprets them, even though Moscow has never fulfilled its obligations under Minsk. And I would say Russia's demands boil down to an insistence that Ukraine abandon its aspirations for a European future and accept neutrality or Finlandization or whatever you want to call it. The military buildup and the disinformation campaign have created the capacity for Russia to act, and to act very soon, but that doesn't mean that Putin has made a decision to act. In fact, most analysts here in Washington believe that he hasn't made a decision and that he's still weighing the risks and the costs of invading and occupying a country of over 40 million people with armed forces that are much bigger, much stronger, much more capable of resisting than they were in 2014. And they didn't do so bad in 2014 after the initial shock. But for now, I think Putin is clearly hoping to use the threat of invasion to pressure and coerce Ukraine and the West into accommodating at least some of Russia's demands without having to fire a shot. And in this regard, he may be counting on the desperation of some in the West to avoid war at any cost. Now, some people have written recently that Putin is bluffing, but we can't afford to assume that in this case. And I think this is how the administration here sees it. They know that the consequences of failure to stop Putin would be devastating. And the stakes, of course, go beyond Ukraine and its survival as a sovereign state, although that's a very vital interest for the United States. But Putin is also testing the West's collective resolve. He's testing our readiness to defend the European security order that we've built since the end of the Cold War, a system, of course, that's based on independence, territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and most importantly, the rejection of spheres of influence. Putin's ultimate aims, in my view, are clear. He wants to roll back the post-Cold War settlement and force us to accept a Europe that is redivided into spheres of influence, basically a new Yalta. And we have to be no less clear-eyed in our response, given what are the stakes. Now, as far as the response thus far, I think the administration and the NATO alliance have responded pretty well, but it's still uncertain whether they've done enough. The Biden administration moved quickly in October and November to raise the alarm publicly and inside NATO and mobilize support for a strategy to deter Russian aggression. The administration shared sensitive intelligence to convince allies of the seriousness of the threat. It engaged proactively with Europe on sanctions options, and it warned Russia at the highest level that it will pay a very heavy price if it invades Ukraine. The administration stepped up the delivery of defensive weapons to Kiev and encouraged other allies to provide military support as well, showing Moscow that its forces will incur significant costs if Russia invades again, far more than in 2014. And of course, Biden delivered a tough message to Putin directly in their phone call last week, warning that Russia will face US and European sanctions going far beyond what we've applied previously if Moscow refuses to de-escalate. While the details haven't been released publicly, I think these measures are strong enough to deepen the stagnation of Russia's economy and curtail its access to the international financial system, as well as reducing Russia's energy leverage over the West. Now, at the same time as threatening these punitive steps, Putin offered Putin a diplomatic way out if Russia stands down from the threat of invasion and chooses instead to raise its concerns at the negotiating table in the appropriate fora. On Donbass, the administration has indicated it's ready to play a more central, even a leading role in the negotiations, either as an additional member of the Normandy format or in some other format which might be more effective, with a view to jump-starting the search for a political settlement. Moscow seems to favor dealing with the US directly rather than with Germany and France. They may think, I think mistakenly, that the US will pressure Ukraine to make concessions. But in fact, the US has reassured Kiev in recent days that it will stand by the principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and that we will continue to reject Moscow's one-sided interpretation of the Minsk agreements, including its farcical claim that Russia isn't even a party to the conflict. The administration has also expressed a readiness to discuss European security issues, including Putin's complaints about NATO in the NATO-Russia Council, the OSCE, or in our bilateral stability talks. Now, some people have questioned the wisdom of negotiating with Russia at all, and especially why it's threatening to invade its neighbor and it's waging hybrid warfare against the NATO alliance. In my view, the United States should make a Russian stand down and pullback of its troops the precondition for negotiations, and I think the administration has stated that. Once that condition is met, we and our allies shouldn't be afraid of directly talking to the Russians, but we do need to be very clear in stating our own red lines. And we have to be very clear that it's Russia, not NATO, that is the prime cause of instability in Europe in recent years, and we're not going to let Russia get away with playing the victim in this conflict. We should be equally clear that we intend to raise our own grievances with Russia, starting with its illegal occupation of its neighbor's territory, its violation of multiple arms control agreements, and its provocative military activities close to NATO's borders. The US and its allies need to stand firm in defending the principles enshrined in the Paris Charter, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and other documents agreed at the end of the Cold War, all of which, by the way, Russia actually helped to write, even though it's violated the letter of just about every one. Now, the big question, and that's what we have to address today, is whether all these measures, sanctions, arming Ukraine, diplomatic dialogue, will be enough to deter Russia and diffuse tensions for the longer term, or will they just buy a little bit of time before the Russians go back to a war footing? Russian pundits say that Putin is betting that the United States and its allies will ultimately let Ukraine go, just as we let Afghanistan go last August. So I think that underscores the need to do even more than we've done thus far to strengthen deterrence if we hope to prove him wrong. Now, of course, the best solution for Kiev would be to fast-track Ukraine's membership in NATO, and I dream of that day coming, but I don't think that's in the cards right now. A more limited step would be to build on the military support for Ukraine to date, to expand the presence of US and allied military forces in Ukraine at ports, training centers, and other military installations. And this would not be to engage in combat, but it would serve as a kind of a tripwire to give more substance to our commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I also think that NATO should make it an alliance responsibility to support Ukraine's defense and deterrence capability, building on the efforts of the United States, the UK, and just the handful of countries that are participating in this effort. All allies should be helping Ukraine deter Russian aggression. Now, doing more militarily along these lines would not be without risk, but putting more US and allied skin in the game, as we say, could make a big difference in affecting Putin's calculations and maybe deter him from crossing the border. Much better to act now, in my view, than waiting until Russia has seized more of Ukrainian sovereign territory. So that's how I see the situation, and I do think more needs to be done, but I look forward to our discussion and to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ambassador. We already received several questions, and thank you to our participants for being so active. And after our first round of discussion, we will respond and open the Q&A session. So now my question goes to Pavlo Grot. And Pavlo, special thanks to the World Congress of Ukrainians for all these years helping Ukraine to become a truly successful with strong institutions country. But coming back to the historical questions, Moscow's imperial behavior began centuries ago and continues today. This year is exactly 300th anniversary of the renaming of what had been known as the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Moscovia, as the Russian Empire by Peter I, who is, by the way, the favorite political leader of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And yet that very name was filched from an agent's entity, Kievan Rus, a great power in Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages and the direct ancestor of today's Ukrainian nation. By appropriating its legacies through this lie, Peter tried to lend legitimacy to his claim to rule over his neighbors. And this year, Ukraine celebrated 30th anniversary of renewed independence. So it's the longest period of our statehood within more than 1,000 years of history. And definitely, this Putin's attempt to return back Ukraine to the Russian or Moscow or sphere of influence, it's another example of the fight or historical battle. So in this situation, it's not just about sending tanks to Ukraine and occupying a part of territory. It's about stealing the history and also destroying our language, our culture. And thanks to the World Congress of Ukrainians, because in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in Germany, so our diaspora did a wonderful job to promote Ukraine during the Soviet time and now. So thanks a lot. But my question is, what can Ukrainian diaspora to do to help Ukraine counter Russian hybrid aggression? And how Ukrainian communities advocate in their countries to support Ukraine? Since I started from quoting Biden's letter from 2015, and I also remember in 2015, the efforts that diaspora and representatives of the SKU, the World Congress of Ukrainians in the US, did to advocate for the Ukraine Freedom Support Act. So actually, what is in your agenda now, and what is your role to counter, to deter Russia? Pavlo? Pavlo, the floor is yours. Pavlo, can you hear me? Maria, could you please help us? Can you hear me? Ambassador Verzbov, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Paul
you
may
hear
be
me.
muted. I see his name, but I don't see his picture.
Maybe we should ask Maria or Timish from the World Congress of Ukrainians.
Я перепрошую, у нас виникла технічна проблема, пані Ганна.
Okay.
I am sorry about this technical issue. Perhaps we can go into the Q&A now.
Oh, thanks, Maria. But before we go to the Q&A, I have one question to Ambassador Verzbov. So, dear Ambassador, this Monday, EU imposes restrictive measures against the Wagner Group. So the Council adopted a set of restrictive measures against the Wagner Group, a Russia-based unincorporated private military entity. The measures target the Wagner Group itself, the 8 individuals and 3 entities connected to it. So the individuals listed by the EU are involved in serious human rights abuses, including torture and also many other criminal activities. So I think it's a very important step because more than 4 years ago, we in Ukraine demanded to recognize such private military entity like Wagner Group as terroristic organizations. And actually, current Russia is a sponsor of terrorism and protecting such organizations. do you think it's, oh, Pablo is with us.
I am with you. My apologies. I hope that was an absolute coincidence that my computer just did an automatic shutdown as I was supposed to speak. So hopefully it wasn't anything nefarious. But do you mind if I jump in now, Hanna?
Yes. So Ambassador Rajbal now knows my question, and after your
noted.
answer, yes, he will respond. Okay, please, Pablo. So please respond.
Thank you. Once again, my apologies. It's a real pleasure to be participating in this discussion with such a distinguished panel. And thank you both for joining. This is you raised a lot of interesting points, Hanna, in your question. And what's really important here is, and what we often miss in the media, is the historical context that you just outlined, to understand, because that's a critical aspect to understand why this is happening, and why this has been happening for the last 300 years. And the Ukrainian people have suffered under Stalin, under today Putin, and the Tsars in particular. So this is part of a lineage, and understanding what's in Putin and the leadership of Russia in their mind in terms of their historical legacy is also important to appreciate. And sometimes we lose sight of that. But I'm glad you raised that. One of the key objectives of the Ukrainian World Congress, and for over the last 55 years, we've been at this globally as the World Congress, and many of our member organizations have been at this even longer in terms of fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And so this is a history that we're all too unfortunately familiar with. And our key objective as the World Congress, which brings together and represents the interests of a very large, arguably over 20 million Ukrainian diaspora around the world and over 65 countries, our key objective is to strengthen the international coalition in support of Ukraine. And the best way we can do so is by speaking to our respective politicians, our leaders, to our media, to civil society in those countries. Because as we all know, politics is local. And so engaging our communities around the world to make sure that we inform leaders and society and the media around the world about the current situation. And what's really going to be key here is speaking in plain language. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've certainly identified more recently. So this topic of gamble of appeasement is very critical today. We have much to learn from history, but I'm not going to reiterate on the excellent comments made by my colleagues, but I'm rather going to focus on the gamble of obfuscation. And what I mean by that is the reluctance of many global leaders to call things by their real names for fear of aggravating Russia. And we've heard that time and time again. And it's that lack of plain speak that has so many countries and their media obfuscating the real situation and thereby weakening global resolve. So information is key here. And that's what I think one role that we as a global diaspora can play. And that is, it's key as Russia continues to obfuscate and twist the reality. Just to point out, in today's Ukraine Alert, and I hope all of you on this webinar receive Ukraine Alert by the Atlantic Council. It's excellent. Peter Dickinson, in an article today, really correctly points out that about the significant impact of Moscow's disinformation tactics. In his question, will Putin invade Ukraine and why? And he points out very correctly that the reality is that Putin has already invaded Ukraine. So we need to call out the misleading phrases, that this isn't a Ukraine crisis. This is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This isn't a Ukraine conflict. This is Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine. This whole false narrative of NATO expansion is that's the reason why Putin has to build up. That's a complete utter nonsense. I mean, this is about rebuilding Russia's empire, plain and simple. And so we have to start off with some basic premise. And I appreciate Ambassador Vershbal's comment about the fact that the world of spheres of influence and empires should be long behind us. Unfortunately, I think we're still struggling with that, especially with an aggressive China and Taiwan, and we see other examples. But we have to start with a very basic premise that Ukraine is a real democracy, whose people have made a decision. They've made a decision to live in freedom and with dignity. They made a decision to embrace Euro-Atlantic values. And what's really key is it's up to these people to choose their own destiny and not for other big powers to decide that for them. So that's first and foremost. So that's, I think, really important for us to tell the global community this. You talked about the challenge that Russia has with its own history, and some of the efforts by Ukraine have really thwarted Russia's attempts to rebuild its empire. Their vision of a third Rome was thwarted by Constantinople granting the Tomos to the Ukrainian, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. You talked about Peter the Great's ideology and Putin's legacy. It's really important to understand the tactics. But getting to very practical aspects of understanding Putin's tactics today, we see that over the last 8 years, he's been testing to see how far he can go. And we've seen even closer examples like Georgia, Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh, are some of the examples where he's certainly tested and is able to extract control. So what we really need is a strong response, quite frankly, from the West. And the Biden meeting with Putin, I think, sent a really strong message. But is that really enough? And we still see, and I'll perhaps point to my home country as an example, where recently Canada's Chief of Defense Staff made a statement about being careful that we don't provoke Putin. And that really is the fundamental danger of appeasement here. Anytime we hear phrases like, we have to be careful not to provoke Putin, we should call that out as appeasement. I don't have to go through the history of appeasement and what the challenges of that is. I think the audience is sophisticated enough to understand the history. But we have to be able to stand up to this bully and demonstrate through strength and resolve. And that's why we really need innovative and out-of-the-box solutions. And I think it's really up to perhaps not the United Nations, because they're not going to be strong enough to do this, but perhaps it's up to the European Union to lead a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine in order to stop this from actually moving forward, because removing Russian soldiers from Ukrainian territory, if they invade even further, will be much more difficult. And that's why it's going to be key that we, as the international community, stand up and send a strong international peacekeeping mission to Ukraine to prevent this Russian incursion. Because if we don't, then we will potentially face a very stark reality. And in conclusion, I think it's really important that we also outline Russia's own challenges, its own human rights abuses within its own country. The fact that there is a constant there is an ethnocide happening against the Ukrainian people within Russia, within Crimea, and in the Donbass. We've seen our communities in Russia completely decimated. All organizations shut down, schools, libraries, cultural centers, all shut down. This demonstrates that Putin really is concerned and afraid of a democratic, free Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlo. I fully agree with your thoughts. And coming back to my previous question to Ambassador Vashbo, so policy recommendations, because it seems like Western governments know very well what actions are required to stop Russia's aggression. What is missing is political will. Before I mentioned the EU imposed restrictive measures against the Wagner Group, but not recognized as a terroristic organizations. So I think we need policies based on the truth of what Russia is today. So Russia must be treated as a sponsor of terrorism, but still coming back to sanctions, because within 8 years of Russian military aggression, sanctions were in place, and there were lots of efforts from diaspora to keep this transatlantic community imposing new sanctions, but it's not enough, and it seems like we need more tougher actions, not to allow Putin to blackmail Western civilization, and actually to see some progress in implementation of his international obligation, from Budapest Memorandum to even the Minsk Accords. So please, Ambassador.
There we go. Thanks very much. First of all, let me say I agree with everything Paul has said about the need to educate the public and the media on what's really going on in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and we have to call it what it is. It is a war. It is not an internal conflict. It's not a civil war. I think it's outrageous that major press services like Reuters, the Associated Press, continue to describe this as a separatist conflict, as opposed to a Russian-sponsored, funded, armed, and managed war against Ukraine. But this is an uphill battle. Once certain stereotypes get established in people's minds, they don't appreciate what's really going on. So I think one thing we need to recommend from this conversation is that governments can't assume that their audiences understand the real nature of this war that's going on, and try to combat these false narratives. NATO tried to do this right after 2014 with a website on debunking Russian myths, but I don't think that effort is on a scale enough to really change these false attitudes that people have. As for your specific question about the Wagner Group, I applaud what the EU has done. I don't know the details of their decision, but clearly Wagner is a very nasty group. It's an instrument of Russian state power, but preserving plausible deniability by being supposedly a private company. But it's clearly taking its strategic direction from somebody in the Kremlin. Whether it meets the legal definition of a terrorist group is something I'm not prepared to address. There are very specific criteria, but clearly it deserves to be sanctioned, and its human rights violations thoroughly exposed to public opinion. But coming back to Paul's point, this argument of not provoking Putin, which we are hearing again in the debate, and that even if he's irrational, we have to understand his own psychology and give him some of what he wants. That is absolutely the wrong way to proceed. We have to show some backbone in this conflict, and think of all the different ways both to expose what's going on and to deter Russia from using force again.
A lot, and we already received 9 questions from the audience, and let's probably start responding to them. But I also, we are talking about let's not be afraid of provoking Putin. And I also would like to continue the saying that let's also discuss the risks of not inviting Ukraine to NATO, because it's also important to know that Russia will perceive it has a de facto veto in NATO. So actually, I think it's really important. And there's one question from our participants today to Ambassador Verzbo. Good afternoon, Mr. Verzbo. I have such question. In your opinion, will Putin try to do something before the session of Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, which will be held in May in Kiev 2020? Like make pressure on borders, especially from Belarus, or probably he will try to start war or invasion. So there is another question from Ola Soroka. It has been reported that patriotic Ukrainians are preparing to take up arms to defend their country, much like the Ukrainian insurgent army UPA did in the 1940s. Thus, will the Ukrainian government support these efforts and work to dispel this? Will probably be first disinformation that this are terror sets. It's probably questions to our Ukrainians, but let's start from these NATO questions, because I think it's one of the red lines that Putin wanted to establish to the West to prevent Ukraine from moving towards NATO membership perspective. And this week in Ukraine, there was a presentation of Diplomacy 2022 foreign policy expectations of Ukrainian society. And what is important also to tell our audience that pro-Western course unchanging and irreversible. Almost 53% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine should become a NATO member against 48% in 2020. So we are seeing some increase in Ukraine public support of NATO membership perspective. And also, actually, we do believe that during the NATO summit in Madrid next year, so we will be advocating in Ukraine reformers community, military experts, and to adopt important legislation, actually to talk about the membership action perspective, even if it's, as some experts recommend us, not to be so enthusiastic. So, Ambassador, how would you respond on the question from one of our participants about new potential Putin's invasion and the connection to the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, which will take place in May next year?
Okay, well, on the specific issue of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting, obviously I can't predict the future, but I would not be surprised if Russia seized on that as some kind of pretext for escalating tensions, possibly provoking incidents to try to embarrass Ukraine as part of its efforts to convince the West, convince other NATO members that it's too risky to bring Ukraine into NATO as a member. So we need to be aware of that kind of gambit by the Russians and do what we can. So first of all, not to let them to disrupt a perfectly legitimate meeting that's going to take place in Ukraine, but also not to in any way set back Ukraine's closer cooperation with NATO, which hopefully will result from that meeting. Now, on the more fundamental question of why is Ukrainian membership such a controversial subject still to this date, it's unfortunately a simple reflection of the fact that many allies, contrary to what we would hope, see that moving too fast on Ukrainian membership, even taking the procedural step of a membership action plan, which is not the same as membership, would, and here we come back to this theme, provoke Putin or create new frictions with Russia. And as much as I would like to see that attitude change by the time of the Madrid summit, I don't think it's going to happen that quickly. So that's why I've recommended not as my first choice, but as my second choice, that NATO should, if it isn't in a position to grant membership and provide the Article 5 security guarantee, then NATO should at least do everything possible, much more than it's doing now, both through NATO and through individual allies, to strengthen Ukraine's deterrent capability to provide cutting-edge technologies which could be produced in cooperation with Ukrainian defense industry, which is by no means backward. It's a very sophisticated industry, but things that will deter Putin from committing the kind of aggression that he committed in 2014. More weapons like the anti-tank weapons that we've already provided, air defense, coastal defense, anti-ship cruise missiles, the kinds of systems that will inflict significant costs on Russia, both in terms of the materiel and even casualties. We have to talk frankly that that's what deters Putin. He doesn't want to have a lot of body bags coming back from occupied parts of Ukraine. So this needs to become a strategic priority of the alliance. I recommended in an article that it become a central pillar of NATO's new strategy for the next decade, because this problem isn't going to go away since Mr. Putin has engineered the possibility of staying president until 2036. So the decade is still in its early stages, but making it a strategic priority to help Ukraine defend itself is the next best thing if we can't move on membership in the near term.
And if I could comment on that as well, and I fully support the comment by Ambassador Vershbow, but I want to just build on a theme here about Ukraine being NATO ready and being at Ukraine's Independence Day celebrations on Independence Day in Kyiv and watching the new military march through downtown Kyiv, you can see, and the support of the NATO partners and the European partners who came to demonstrate their support for Ukraine. It shows that Ukraine is a different military today than it did, as mentioned, 7 years ago, and moving in that direction is really important. The other thing, and Ukrainian World Congress has been advocating and will continue to advocate for Ukraine's membership into NATO. So just to be clear on that, but I do think that there are other options. And I think there are other things to consider is regional coalitions, regional support. Obviously, the Poles, the Baltic countries, and others. Creating regional security coalitions, and then coming back to the whole discussion around a peacekeeping force. Minister of Defense Reznikov made a call to what he called the Anglo-Saxon countries to put their troops even the training troops that they're doing training in Western Ukraine, to put those closer to the front, so that you do see a Canadian and an American and a UK flag in Donbass. Those are steps that are pretty straightforward to take, and those are things that we should be calling on Ukraine's allies to do immediately. And again, to remind them that of the security guarantees of the Budapest Memorandum. I mean, that was a thing we talked about in 2014. Again, everybody sort of shirked their responsibilities on that front as well. And under those premises, I think that there's full rationale for why the UK and the US, who are signatories on the Budapest Memorandum, should be putting their training forces in Eastern Ukraine. And then, finally, turning back to my earlier point about a peacekeeping mission. This is something that was on the table still in 2015. There was even a tacit acceptance by Putin for this, and there was a disagreement about whether it would be on the border of Ukraine and Russia, or whether it would be on the border of the occupied territories. Well, quite frankly, at this point, I think either would be beneficial to Ukraine, and would certainly significantly impede and would deter any kind of a full-scale Russian invasion.
Thank you, Pavlo. And Tatiana Radomska also expressed her gratitude for the truth, and also asking a question. Maybe we, all Ukrainians and honest people in the world, should make the flash mobs, petitions, program like Seeds of Truth, to keep attention of 8 years Russian war, to do it with simple words and slogans, posters. Could Ukrainian Congress lead this part of big fight against Russia? It seems like you're already leading, but what would you like to add to these ideas as a head of Ukrainian World Congress?
So I appreciate that comment, and I fully support that. And what we have to be doing is, flash mobs are very important. Anything that we can do to raise awareness is very important. But getting involved in politics in your respective countries is extremely important. Sitting down with policymakers, sitting down with media, sitting down with building your coalition of allies in the countries where you live is going to be critical. Whether it's the academic community, the think tank community, the media, the political communities, get them involved. Get them. Don't wait for a command to come out of the Ukrainian World Congress headquarters that this is what we're doing. We're certainly going to be supporting and promoting and providing all the materials and all the briefing notes to support any kind of initiatives. But I do welcome and encourage you to make sure that you're constantly engaging in your respective countries on this.
Thank you. Another question from Walter Dershko to the panelists. Ambassador Volodymyr Ohrysko has predicted that Russia could collapse due to shrinking energy exports by 2030-35. Could this pending attack be Putin's final Hail Mary pass to hold on to Ukraine? So there are different, versions of what could happen with Putin's Russia. And this week, everybody in Ukraine watched the weak and very aggressive reaction of Putin to Mr. Sokolov. And Putin said that there are 2,000 conflicts with territorial pretension in Russian Federation. So it seems like Putin, with his the lowest popularity, around 30%, within his more than 20 years of ruling the Russia Federation. So Ambassador Veshbo and Pavlo, how would you respond on this question from Walter Dershko?
Well, I think he raises an important point that in time, as the world gets more serious about climate change and begins to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels, there will be major loss of export capacity by Russia, and its failure to diversify its economy will catch up with it, whether it's in the 5 years mentioned in the question or a little later, I don't know. But I also would caution against basing plans on Russia declining as a power. It's built up its military capabilities in a substantial way in the last 10, 12 years. And Putin is determined to assert Russian influence in the world, even if we might hope to have some kind of stable and predictable relationship. He wants to be noticed, he wants attention, and he wants his sphere of influence, and he's going to continue to press for that, even if Russia's fortunes on the world energy markets begin to decline. There have been several articles lately about don't bank on Russian collapse, and I think that's wise advice. We have to be realistic, but look at what we can do to change Russian behavior. That's the key. We may not be able to see more pro-Western leadership in Russia for a long time to come.
Thanks a lot. And Pavlo?
I just would say that, look, the trend for decarbonization is certainly going to weaken Russia's economy. There's no question about that. But I agree with the ambassador that this is not something that's going to change over the next few years dramatically, going to impede Russia. So I think that what we really need to do is focus on ensuring that their monopoly position is somehow measured. And I think that's the biggest challenge, because they're now responsible for all energy flows into Europe, quite frankly, and that's something we really need to focus on is how do we provide energy security and energy independence to Europe and also to Ukraine itself. I mean, Ukraine has both the challenge where it's still very much reliant on energy resources from Russia. Of course, the Brotherhood pipeline and the question about whether that is itself a security guarantee for Ukraine, with the Brotherhood pipeline becoming potentially obsolete with Nord Stream 2. That's going to certainly weaken Ukraine's deterrence capability here. So I mean, that's a big lever, and I think that's really been stressed over the last few weeks is what happens to Nord Stream 2.
Thank you, Pavlo, for raising the issue of Nord Stream 2, because actually in Ukraine, we were very disappointed with this Biden-Merkel deal. And in fact, it was in response to the easing of sanctions against Nord Stream 2 that Russia began to draw a huge number of weapons and military into Ukraine's border. So Putin uses the weaknesses of the West to strengthen his position and actually to bring more military than to blackmail Western communities. So we have more questions coming, and I hope we will manage to respond with respect to all our participants. So Ambassador Veshbo, question from Platon Boyko. Don't you think that the West needs to actually do something instead of renewing warnings like SWIFT disconnect now, and etc.? Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think we, making clear to Putin right now, while we're trying to achieve de-escalation, making clear to him what kind of punishment he will face if he launches a new attack on Ukraine is the main focus. But it may become necessary if Putin seems to be evading serious discussions to implement some of the sanctions just to show that we're serious. I mean, this is a tactical judgment, but we don't want to give Putin the wrong impression that these are just paper threats and that we're not ready to follow through. And that's where I agree with Hanna, with your comment there about Nord Stream 2. I think this was a very weak point in the Biden administration's approach to Russia all through the past year, and I think it's contributed to some of the mixed signals that still may be being received in Moscow about just how serious the U.S. and the alliance are about deterring and containing Russia. I'm encouraged by statements suggesting that if Russia does invade, Nord Stream 2 will be terminated, or at least suspended for the indefinite future. That includes German statements. The new government, I think, is a little bit more critical of Nord Stream 2 than was Angela Merkel. But Putin is always probing for signs of weakness, and we have to show unity. We have to show consistency when we make threats that we hope will deter Russia from launching new aggression against Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, and I agree with you that the consolidated position of the collective West is critically important. And there is another question to Pavlo, because this week is also the week of very sad information that Ukraine blamed Germany for blocking NATO weapons supply. And with the new government of Germany, with the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Minister of Economy, there is a question to Pavlo Grot. What do you think about Germany and its prohibition about weapon, which could be delivered to Ukraine? How can we gain success in important questions like delivery of weapons if agents of Russia like Merkel do such things? So the questions, to trying to be diplomatic, Pavlo, what is recommendations and what actually Ukrainian World Congress do with the new government? Because I'm encouraging Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada to start working with the new Bundestag members and actually trying to change their approaches towards Ukraine, and also to support Ukrainian Euro-Atlantic move, and also to provide Ukraine with weapons, especially in the situation which we are facing now.
So there is certainly a silver lining with the new government. I wouldn't go as far or nearly as far as to call Chancellor Merkel an agent of Russia. I think that she's done a very fine job standing up to Putin over the years and balancing a very difficult situation. Although we certainly did expect a lot more from her and her government. But I think with the new the challenge with the new chancellor, of course, is that his party has traditionally been a little bit more pro-Russian leaning. So we'll see how far that goes, but it's certainly balanced by two very key green ministers, the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, both green members, and very pro-Ukrainian. So it'll be an interesting dynamic. We'll be actually meeting with them in late January, early February, pandemic permitting the ability to travel and meet. But I will say that to your point about Ukraine and the work of the Verkhovna Rada, and I think when you were in Parliament, Hanna, you and your colleagues were very, very active in traveling to different global capitals in Europe and across North America to press the agenda and to build those relationships. And that's really critical, and it's really critical for Ukraine to move in that direction and do a charm offensive. I think Ukraine really needs that to build that charm offensive. We're there to support that, but they need to hear it. Politicians, policymakers need to hear it from their Ukrainian colleagues. So certainly do very much encourage that.
Thank you, Pavlo. And I do believe, and I'm sure that you and Ukrainian MPs from both ruling party and democratic opposition will start immediately working with the new Bundestag and the new government of Germany. So, dear speakers, thank you for your presentations. Questions from Lesia Ponomarenko. How do you evaluate the risk that the West and NATO would finally choose to stay aside and wait while Ukraine would be facing Russian attacks? Do you think Ukraine has to be prepared for the scenario of facing Russia alone if the promised sanctions would not be sufficient to hold back their attacks? May I also, because we have many questions, also one question from Facebook, which is in the logic of this question. Ambassador Vershbow, was it correct on President Biden's part to rule out right away sending US troops into Ukraine? Shouldn't President Biden have left all options on the table to deter Putin?
Well, those two questions are related to one another.
Yeah.
I think it was probably realistic, given the dangers of escalation to even to nuclear war, to be clear about how far the United States is prepared to go in extending support to Ukraine. As I was discussing earlier, I see ways to push the envelope a little bit, but still preserving a clear line between combat forces and indirect support to Ukrainian capabilities. And I would like to see more of the indirect support, but I'm not advocating a combat role. Even though on a moral level, one could justify it. But clearly, we want to prevent escalation, and we want Ukraine to survive as a sovereign, independent state. It means that deterrence is not quite as effective as it might be, but the risks of escalation are more limited. I think in the dark scenario in which sanctions and other pressure are insufficient to deter Putin from taking the decision to invade, Ukraine still will not be alone. I think the United States would intend to continue to provide military support, intelligence assistance, cyber defense, things that could at least help Ukraine withstand the onslaught of Russian forces, and of course would continue to work with allies to raise the sanctions pressure even further, and to consider other kinds of punitive steps to get the Russians to pull back. But I think that the challenge now, though, is to do more to shore up the deterrence capabilities of Ukraine as best we can, and to get more allies involved. In this regard, the point about Germany is important. Germany has been one of the most reluctant to support military aid to Ukraine, and I hope that the new government will review this very rigid stance. I think the case that was mentioned about Germany blocking some small arms deliveries was a special case relating to collective procurement through the Nato Support and Procurement Agency. But I don't think we should assume that the new government is going to take the same rigid stance. I hope not, because the more allies involved, the more support Ukraine can get, and the more political solidarity it will convey to Moscow, and hopefully give it some reason to hesitate in attacking Ukraine again.
If I could just add to that briefly, first off, I think Ukraine has to always be prepared to go it alone. I mean, it has strong coalition of supporters, but the question will be, how far are they prepared to go? And I think, again, Ukraine has to be prepared to go it alone. And it's that age-old saying, hope for the best, plan for the worst. But we also have to be careful that Ukraine has to be very careful not to be provoked. And so it's not a matter of, that's a fine balancing act, is, do you roll over to a Russian invasion, but you also be careful, and the answer is no, but you also be careful that Ukraine doesn't get provoked a la Georgia did in 2008. And I think that's a very key strategy that Ukrainians have to be prepared to understand how to deal with that. What I just wanted to also mention is that one thing that really came out of the Biden-Putin meeting was a clear understanding of what the realistic consequences are. And I think that everything was put on the table, and that was really key. I think I'm seeing this for perhaps the first time, that the US has been very, very clear on what the consequences of an invasion are. Before it was, there will be more sanctions, but here they put them quite clearly on the table. The other point I wanted to mention is, again, our allies in the region. And we keep going back to the US, but Ukraine has strong allies in the region, and leveraging those allies and leveraging those countries that also are currently facing security risks from Russia, that being Georgia, that being Moldova. And the question Putin will have to face is, will he be able to fight a war on multiple fronts? Because this may escalate into other regions. And so this is not just a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This could impact the whole region. It could be a matchbox.
Thank you so much for your answers. But another question: the West knows exactly which Russians have laundered money in Western banks. Is the asset freeze option on the table as possible sanction? So I might add to this question, because in Ukraine, we were so thankful for imposing sanctions on Mr. Medvedchuk, a close ally of Putin. Also, last week, new sanction on Mr. Portnov and others who are undermining our efforts to reform Ukraine. But what's about Mr. Firtash, who is sitting in Vienna for 7 years and without any results of extradition to the US? So is the asset freeze option on the table as a possible sanction? Maybe Ambassador Vershbow and then Pavlo, what is the role of diaspora to sanctions? We know about Global Magnitsky Act for those who are violating human rights or abusing human rights. So what is the question? What is the response for this question?
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can answer. I'm not an expert on sanctions. We don't know exactly what is in the agreed package that the U.S. and Europe have been working on. But I would expect that asset freezes are at least on the list of options. And the U.S. is, I think, trying to clean up its own domestic situation by making it harder to for Russians or criminals from around the world to exploit the U.S. banking system and launder money through U.S. banks. I think we in the Brits have to do a lot of self-examination. We may lecture other countries about cracking down on organized crime and money laundering, but we have a problem in our own front yard, not even our backyard, with this problem. But I expect there'll be, both sectoral measures and additional sanctions against individuals, particularly focusing on people close to Putin, which would include people like Medvedchuk and Portnov, and Firtash for that matter. But again, I don't know the details of what's in the sanctions package this time around.
And in terms of, you mentioned Magnitsky Act, Hanna, I think that's a really powerful tool that many governments have started to adopt, and that's something that we want to continue, and we will continue to promote across the globe for governments to not only adopt the Magnitsky or similar legislation, but the enforcement is going to be key, and that's where we need to hold our leaders in our respective countries accountable and hold them to account for enforcing this the Magnitsky type legislation, and we can certainly continue to shine a light, because again, politicians listen to their electorate, and if their electorate is saying, listen, you have oligarchs living amongst you in London apartments, luxury apartments, or in Germany or Austria, it's up to the global to civil society to point that out and to hold our politicians, our legislators to account for them to not only implement legislation, but ensure that it is acted upon and enforced.
Thank you so much. And we in Ukraine will continue to demand the extradition of Mr. Firtash and also sanctions on Mr. Kolomoisky and other Ukrainian oligarchs like Mr. Akhmetov, because definitely on the one hand, they are trying to position themselves as a good guys using their media, and in their TV channels, we could see anti-Western narratives, what is happening at the Akhmetov TV channel, which is against the national interest of Ukraine. So we will discuss this, but let also respond to the question from Andriy Maletsky. what conditions does Ukraine still need to meet to be eligible for NATO membership? Are the requirements different than they were when other post-Soviet states were offered NATO membership? I think it's a very important question, because in Ukraine, sometimes we are like kidding, saying like, even if Ukraine adopt all important legislation, there still will be countries within NATO which will be against our membership and no consensus to accept us, or some countries which will be afraid of making or provoking Putin. So what are your response to these questions?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there's no kind of agreed list or checklist of the precise steps that candidates need to take. And at the end of the day, it's a political decision. And so progress on defense reforms, interoperability of armed forces and of command and control systems, training standards, there's lots of ways to measure Ukrainian progress. But at the end of the day, it's still a political decision. And that brings in other factors, including different countries' anxiety levels regarding the Russia factor. So I think there's general agreement. And I think it's an objective judgment of allies that Ukraine is still not quite there yet. But if Ukraine continues to do its homework on reforms, if it continues to display tremendous professionalism in its conduct of the operations against the Russian forces in Donbass, and begins to assimilate even more sophisticated defense technology, it'll be hard to make a case that Ukraine isn't ready to be a good ally, not only a beneficiary of alliance protection, but a major security provider, contributing to the protection of other allies. So I regret Ukraine has to be more patient than it would prefer to be, but keep doing the homework. Don't give NATO or individual allies excuses to say that Ukraine has disqualified itself because of some failure. If, for example, there was a long delay in the reform of the SBU, and that was cited as an example of why Ukraine wasn't ready. So do your homework, be a good pupil, and hope that the political winds will begin to shift more in favor of Ukrainian getting MAP and ultimately moving down the membership track itself.
And unfortunately, it's not a checklist. So it's a political decision. And we've spoken to, and I've spoken to legislators in Germany, in France, who've said very bluntly to me that Ukraine, as long as there is an active war and conflict happening in Ukraine, we will not support NATO membership for Ukraine. And this is coming, again, from members of the Legislative Assembly of France and of the Bundestag. So we certainly do have that, again, that political will that we need to overcome.
Thanks a lot. There's some questions and even debates between our participants. Turkey is a key Ukrainian ally against Putin. Christopher is writing, and Maria Flynn is saying, not sure if that is true. Both Turkey and Hungary were not invited to a Biden planned summit regarding authoritarian governments. It means Biden Summit for Democracy, which took place December 9-10, and the year of action started already, and next summit will be next year in person. But it's important to monitor the commitments which governments which participated in the summit made. So the role of Turkey in deterring Russian aggression, I would probably add in the Black Sea region and the Sea of Azov. So Ambassador Versbot, considering your experience within the NATO, how would you respond?
Yeah, Turkey is a difficult ally in some ways, but it's a very important and very capable ally. And so I think Ukraine is an area where Turkey and the other allies generally see eye to eye. But even then, Turkey is somewhat ambivalent about an expanded NATO maritime presence in the Black Sea. protecting its authorities under the Montreux Convention. And I think that has stood in the way of establishing some kind of standing NATO task force or fleet in the Black Sea as a stronger deterrent against Russian efforts to restrict freedom of navigation there. But Turkey has, of course, provided the very important Bayraktar drones, which has quite angered the Russians, but I think it's a legitimate capability that can help deter the Russians from launching new aggression. So we need to kind of encourage Turkey to accentuate the positive here on what's been accomplished, and find other ways to help Turkey beef up its support for Ukraine militarily as well as politically. Turkey focuses mainly on the problem of the Crimean Tatars. I think it would be good to encourage Turkey to address broader human rights issues as well as the Crimean Tatars, and to become more active in the Crimea platform as a way of further showing the Russians that they're isolated in their claims to have annexed Crimea.
I think Turkey certainly demonstrated a strong commitment to Ukraine on a number of fronts, pointing back to 3 years ago now, with the granting of the Tomos, even though that was agreed to by the Patriarch of Constantinople. But that was also a political decision by Turkey itself to allow that to happen. So it's interesting the relationship there. We talk about the exchange of drone technology with Ukraine, but we also have to be mindful that Russia is one of Turkey's largest, if not the largest, trading partners, and so there's always that delicate relationship and balancing. So we should certainly be prepared to count on Turkey, but be mindful of the level of commitment that Turkey is prepared to maintain.
Thanks. Before we will conclude our session, Pavlo, some question also to you. Pavlo, should not Germany be reminded, as Yale historian Timothy Snyder has pointed out in his speech in the Bundestag, that particularly in view of the suffering Germany perpetrated in Ukraine during World War II, that it has a particular responsibility vis-a-vis Ukraine. With the building of Nord Stream 2 and denying military aid to Ukraine, Germany seems to consider Ukraine disposable and inferior to Germany's economic goal based on its partnership with Russia.
So we've had the challenge in Germany, in particular with relation to that sense of that debt that Germans owe to Russians for the millions, tens of millions of deaths associated with World War II, and Russia, I mean, started with the Soviet Union, but Russia has taken on the honor of wearing that responsibility. And that certainly played against Ukraine. And one of the things that Ukraine needs to do, and we have to do as a global community, is to remind the Germans that of those 20 million Soviets that died as a result of the Second World War, a large percentage, if not over half, were Ukrainians. And I think that certainly it comes into the politics of supporting Russia and of feeling that sense of they owe them a debt. And that's certainly some work that needs to get done by Ukrainians, is to help the German people understand that those losses were not just Russian losses, but a large number were Ukrainians. So I think we need to start turning and it all comes into the information war. I mean, that's where we started this discussion, was around the obfuscation of, who were the victims, who were the ones that are creating the crisis or that are launching the war. So again, it's speaking in plain language here.
Pavlo and Ambassador Vershbow, summarizing this year, 2021, what are the biggest achievements of the Western civilization and failure?
You could take a first cut at that one, Ambassador. I'll follow you.
I was afraid you were going to say that. That's a big question. Obviously, our precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan has to go down as a failure, and one that raised raised questions about NATO, but especially by U.S. Commitment to fulfilling its own strategic objectives and living up to the values that it has pledged to defend. I think actually this year, however, has been a good one, even as we look at those 100,000 plus Russian troops. I think it's been a good year for U.S.-Ukrainian partnership and cooperation. I think we've seen the uncertainties raised by Donald Trump that led to impeachment pretty much put behind us, and a much more concerted approach being taken by the U.S. government, particularly by the Pentagon, to security assistance for Ukraine, aimed at bolstering Ukraine's deterrent capability. And I think the Strategic Partnership Commission being relaunched, new charter, also kind of are promising developments for the year 2021. Clearly, there are many other crises in the world. We're facing probably the most challenging strategic environment in my memory as a diplomat, and that goes back to the 70s. And it's particularly challenging when we have two major powers, Russia and China, who are trying to upend the international order. But I think Russia is even more of a revisionist power than China, and deserves our full attention as we go into 2022.
Thank you so much, Paulo.
I'd add to that the resolve and the stability of the global democracies is certainly a success. I think there was a lot of concern around populist movements a couple of years ago or a few years ago, rising in many of the European democracies and even in the North American democracies. But I see that that tide has sort of turned, and that we're seeing a strengthening of resolve of democracies and of the institutions that protect those democracies. So I think that that's a real plus. I also think a big plus is the more Ukraine, the more time Ukraine has, the more successful it will be. And Ukraine is transforming. And I was just participated in an economic forum yesterday put on by Ukraine Invest, and talking about the various successes that Ukraine is having. And so I think that the more time Ukraine has to live in peace, it will transform, it will rebuild, it will be a strong democracy. And that has certainly demonstrated, which I think is one of the biggest accomplishments that Ukraine has had in the last 30 years, is the stable democracy. And we just need to continue to build on that and build those institutions that will guarantee that those stay in place.
Thank you, Paulo. And also we received from Oksana Piasecki message. Thank you for being one of the first to sign our letter to the Pulitzer Prize Board to recall Walter Durandi's prize. We have started a campaign for signatures on Change.org, which you can find on the Ukraine Genocide.com. Please sign this petition and pass on to all that you know, so that we can garner many more signatures before once again facing the board. So thank you, Pane Peter and Oksana, for doing this. I think it's very important to recognize Holodomor as a genocide, because we talk a lot today about history and why history matters, and especially in Putin's geopolitical ambitions, and also for Ukraine, delivering the truth about painful pages of our history, especially from 20th centuries, is also important to show that Ukrainians survived in 20th centuries. Now we resist, and we are contributing to the European security. So we are not just asking about help. We are also stopping Putin from invasion in other countries. And I'm happy that next week there will be a Lublin Triangle meeting at presidential level in Kiev. And last week, the deputy ministers of foreign affairs from Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine met in Lubark Castle in Lutsk at the level of national coordinators. And this is my dream with the next decade to meet in Lutsk, Lubark Castle, when in 2029, this will be a 600th anniversary when the royal dynasties of Europe met in this castle. So, Ambassador Vershbow, we in Ukraine are very optimistic regarding the future of Ukraine. So we believe that within next decade, Ukraine will join NATO. We are ready to share with Georgia 31st place and to become 32 or 31st, 32. But what is like finalizing our important discussion for you and for Pavlo questions? What are your optimistic vision for 2030? And what we need to do proactively to reach this dream or this goal? I just tell you my dream, to see Ukraine a member of NATO within the next decade until 2030. So what is your optimistic vision and what we need to do?
Well, I first of all am optimistic that the West will come together and come up with the leverage needed to deter Russia from actually starting another phase of the war in the immediate context. And I think that there then may be some real opportunities for creative diplomacy, with the United States working hand in glove with Ukraine on trying to actually defuse and settle the Donbass conflict once and for all. I think there were some ideas mentioned earlier in our conversation about peacekeeping forces. I think they could be an instrumental tool to square the circle on some of the provisions of Minsk that have prevented progress thus far. But of course, the main thing that's needed is for Putin to make the political decision that he wants a political settlement in Donbass. Then the details will be relatively easy. But peacekeeping force could provide security for a transition period that would get the Russians and their so-called volunteers out of Donbass, and secure conditions established with a neutral international peacekeeping force that could then organize elections and other steps back towards full Ukrainian sovereignty. So I'm optimistic that creativity of diplomats will be put to the test, but that we'll achieve some progress in ways that we haven't in recent years. And I think the difference, is going to be stronger U.S. engagement in the diplomacy, as well as close U.S.-Ukrainian cooperation. Looking down the road, I too hope that Ukraine's prospects for joining NATO will become brighter in the course of 2022. I'd like to see it happen even before the end of the decade, but if we can get Ukraine in by 2030, I would break out the champagne.
Thanks, Ambassador. After Bucharest summit, when we were promised a membership action plan, it's already past 13 years. So of course, if it happens earlier, so let's celebrate, and Ukrainian World Congress will sponsor this celebration if it happens early. So I'm just kidding. So Pavlo, what is your optimistic? Let's be more optimistic today.
So look, I think short term, what we really want to focus on is to make sure that we have the international community speaking plainly about what is happening, and I think that's really important to make sure that we continue to emphasize. So speak in plain language what is actually going on, so that we stop the obfuscation. So that's number one. Number two, we need to take some out of the box thinking. We've been trying the same tactics, ratcheting up sanctions over the last 7+ years, and it has some impact, but we need to start thinking more out of the box here, because Putin is certainly trying to think outside the box here. And I think that the peacekeeping mission is certainly one of those innovative out-of-the-box approaches that will certainly put a wrinkle in Putin's strategy here, and it'll certainly bring peace and sort of and quite frankly deter a full-scale invasion. In terms of vision for 2030, I think you mentioned, I think the best thing we could be hopeful for is a democracy in Russia. If we could get a real democracy in Russia where the leadership of the Russian Federation respects the dignity of its people, like we see in Ukraine, then we can all live at peace with our neighbors in that region. So that's my very optimistic, ambitious hope for 2030.
Thanks a lot. You are right. Successful Ukraine is a nightmare for Putin and Putinism. But successful Ukraine is a wonderful example for Russian citizens, what to demand from Russian leadership, actually. So I do believe that we are democracy. Ukraine is democracy in action. Now, within 30 years after renewed independence, we proved that we are changing and we are a very dynamic country and nation. So with this optimistic look into the future, after such, I would say, tough discussion and questions on how to respond, how to be effectively deter Russia, and I would like to add more authoritarian regimes, not just Russia. We also keep reminding Lukashenko's regime, and it's also a part of successful Ukraine mission to help Belarusian people fighting for democracy, dignity, and freedom. So thanks a lot, Pavlo and Ukrainian World Congress for initiating this discussion, and also Ambassador Versbow, thanks for your experience, your strong support, strong voice. And I think today, actually, all policy recommendations from recognition of military entities like Wagner Group as a terroristic organization, tougher sanctions, more military aid, especially to help us in air defense. So, and resilience versus hybrid threats. This is the topic of Democracy in Action International Conference, which will take place next year in Kyiv, June 6-7. And World Congress or Ukrainian World Congress is a partner of the conference, this Zero Oligarchs initiative. So we do hope to see Canadian leadership, US leadership like we had this year. And actually, I think it's important for Ukraine to be a true trendsetter, agenda setter, and also leader of the region. So this is my vision, and thanks to all Ukrainians which are working hard to make Ukraine strong. Maybe final words, if you have, Petro or Ambassador, some Christmas wishes to the audience, and we will finish today's event.
Well, thank you, Hannah, for hosting, and I appreciate your spirit of supporting democracy. Let me just wish all my friends in Ukraine and all Ukrainians a peaceful holiday season. Let's hope Mr. Putin doesn't spoil our holidays this year. And let's build on our increasingly strong cooperation to put in place a strategy for actually bringing peace to Ukraine and an end to the war with Russia, and continued progress on Ukraine's path towards Euro-Atlantic integration, which is the right path for Ukraine, whether the Russians like it or not.
Thank you. And I wanted to, on behalf of the Ukrainian World Congress, first off, thank Ambassador Versbow for your participation, your insightful comments, and it certainly helps to continue to build this global coalition. So thank you for your continued support of Ukraine and participation in this important event. And Hanna, thank you as always. Congratulations on the great work that your NGO is doing, that ANS is doing. We always like working with you, and we appreciate your very capable moderation and your insightful comments. So on behalf of the Ukrainian World Congress, I want to wish all Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine all the best for the holiday season. Veselih Sviat, Christos Narodivся, a little early, but best wishes for the holidays.
Славімо його, слава Україні.
Слава Україні, героям слава.
Дякую. So thanks a lot, and see you next year. Okay, thanks a lot, and thanks to the team of Ukrainian World Congress for also technical support, Maria, Timish, and all who organized this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. І всім, хто ставив питання, теж дуже дякуємо. Thanks, Ambassador.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
We need to
I'm
bring
logging off.
somebody from UK